As Chris and the others stepped out of the car, several mountain folk eating inside glanced toward the door. Go see! Who's here?" the one-eyed man stammered to his two brothers. The three-fingered man and the burly, mostly intact brother crept to the entrance and peered out. "Humans I've never seen before, and a dog," the three-fingered man blurted. "Do they have weapons? Are they here to help?" the one-eyed man asked nervously. The larger brother shook his head. "No weapons, but that human, he looks strong, stronger than me." "Should we hide?" the three-fingered man asked, panic in his voice. "What if they've come to catch us?" Before the one-eyed man could decide, Chris called out in a clear, authoritative voice, "You three listen. We're with the Forestry Bureau. We found evidence of illegal hunting. Surrender now." Brian stared at Chris in surprise. He'd always thought Chris was all talk, but the man's calm, official tone carried weight. Jiaozi watched with curiosity. Unlike the other corrupted humans they'd seen, these mountain folk didn't have the telltale signs of having eaten human flesh. When Chris spoke, the one-eyed man, who'd been frozen in thought, suddenly stormed out of the shack, indignant. "That's a lie. We're not savages. Why would we hunt so much?" His brothers chimed in, defensive. "Yeah, we survive off whatever valuables we find in wrecked cars. We sell those in town and buy food." "With fries and burgers around, who'd eat smelly old game?" added the big brother. Hearing them explain themselves and using his mental perception to check their auras, Chris realized they weren't Wendigos. "All right, then maybe my colleague misread the report. Mistook animals hit by cars for deliberate hunts," he said, letting his tone soften. The three mountain folk were stunned. Humans they'd met before had been hostile, at best frightened and kicking them away, at worst grabbing weapons. That history was why the one-eyed man and the three-fingered man bore their injuries. Over time, they'd learned to be cunning, rescue stranded travelers at night, masked, then demand payment, pillage dead vehicles for valuables, bury the bodies, and use the goods to buy food and make offerings to their mountain deity. They'd never expected someone would talk to them calmly. Chris didn't have time for a long conversation, though. Once he'd confirmed they weren't corrupted, he wanted to investigate the Wendigo behind them. Jiaozi, however, was curious about the mountain folk. He stepped forward bluntly. "Give me some of your body tissue." The trio looked at him, baffled. "What kind of tissue?" "Hair? Cutting meat hurts," one of them said, genuinely concerned. Without explaining, Jiaozi hopped up, plucked a few strands of leg hair from each of the three, and turned to leave. As Chris and the others walked away, Chris handed them a small box of dragon blood potion, both a reward and a test to see if they could become normal like Ruby. The mountain folk watched them go, bewildered. Once the group was out of sight, curiosity won. They opened the potion and quickly grew excited. "Oh, this is great," one cried. "So tasty!" The one-eyed man, most wary due to past human cruelty, tasted it carefully, then cautioned, "This must be drunk sparingly." But the other two didn't listen. They split the potion at once. "This is your share," they told him. "How we drink ours is none of your business," and dove in. Meanwhile, Brian had driven the car to a cave entrance under Chris's direction. "Is this the Wendigo's lair?" he asked. Chris glanced down at Jiaozi, who looked oddly pleased, as if he'd learned something. "Not exactly," Jiaozi said in fragments. "It's different. Amazing. I need more info to be sure." Brian looked to Chris for an explanation, but Chris just sighed and pushed open the cave mouth. "Let's go in and see. I don't know what he means either." They stepped inside. A damp, cold aura washed over Brian at once, gnawing at his limbs and pressing at his mind with a lethargy that made him want to stop moving. Before the effect could take hold, Chris unleashed his own presence and shielded Brian, blocking the infecting chill. Clear-headed again, Brian asked, "What was that? Some kind of radiation?" Chris didn't have time to answer. The cavern opened up and revealed something unexpected. Sprawled on an enormous cushion like a living room sofa was a corpulent, deer-headed man. He sipped from a cola can and watched a soap opera on a battered television, the picture wavering. This was the Wendigo Chris had killed 5 times before, yet it looked more like a couch potato than a savage monster. The creature finished chewing, stretched, and rolled over to look at them. "Ugh, who are you people? Have you come for blessings? Did you bring offerings?" it asked, lazily reaching into an iron bucket beside the cushion and pulling out a fried fish to pop in its mouth. Chris exchanged a baffled look with Giozzi. No matter how he peered at it, this Wendigo was calm, almost domesticated, far from the brutal thing he'd fought before. 102. Who is the monster? A dark, damp cave. The Wendigo crouched on the stone, surprisingly harmless under the strange visitor's attention. This was the Family Guy world, though, and whatever goodwill it might have held was not about to be returned. Sour Radish, tell me why your transformation is so extreme. Giozzi, Dumpling shouted, perched on the creature's chest and yanking its antlers back and forth. His voice was a mixture of sharp curiosity and brute force. Nearby, Chris finished wiping his blade and reluctantly sheathed his combat knife. He gave an apologetic shrug. Sorry, buddy, I can't help it. Those weapons are too cool. Chris wasn't normally so crude when interrogating things, but Giozzi had promised him a full set of Astartes-style gear. That was enough bribery. Without another thought, Chris slashed the Wendigo into a messy pile. Immortality, however, can be stubborn. Even reduced to a heap of flesh, the Wendigo's mind remained clear. Before it could even scream, Brian let out a high-pitched yelp and clapped his paws over his ears. Ah! Oh my God, what are you doing? Chris turned, confused at Brian's sudden panic. Giozzi likewise looked over, annoyed. What was this mutt making a fuss about? The Wendigo watched too, its animal face puzzled at the panicked canine. When Brian saw the Wendigo's still living eyes, he froze and flushed. Oh, sorry, I thought you guys killed it. Carry on. He turned his back and melted into the shadows as if he'd rather disappear. Chris and Giozzi were used to Brian's dramatic flinches. They barely noticed. The Wendigo, however, felt its last thread of hope unravel. It watched those around it with darkening eyes, convinced its end had come. Slap. Giozzi's tiny hand came down on the Wendigo's head, more a pet than a punishment. The blow barely disturbed anything. With an exaggerated flourish, Chris delivered a real slap, partly to save Giozzi from embarrassment, and the deer-like head spun sideways. Chris scooped Giozzi up and grinned, thinking himself charming. Giozzi was unimpressed. I know you want a blast gun, Giozzi snapped, but if you kill it, where am I supposed to finish my interrogation? Chris hesitated, then fished the Wendigo out of the wall with careful hands. Hey, buddy, you absolutely cannot die. His earlier strike had been far stronger than he meant, and this Wendigo, unlike those in the ogre world, didn't have an endless well of power to fall back on. Severely wounded, it was near death. Chris shoved a vial of dragon's blood potion into the creature's throat like it was nothing, then uncorked a second and forced that down too. Almost immediately, the Wendigo's life force steadied, flesh knitted back, wounds closed. Chris shook the dazed head. Wake up! Wake up! The Wendigo woke with a sob, snot and tears running from its muzzle. Who are you? What do you want from me? Please, don't torment me anymore. I can't take it. Hey, calm down, Chris murmured, his voice gentling as he used a quiet telepathic touch to soothe the thing. The psychic ability was faint on its own, but bolstered by the vitality Chris had poured into the potion, it carried weight. Odd, extraordinary creatures could be affected now. In a few breaths, the Wendigo's frantic energy ebbed. Its pleading tone shifted to hollow resignation. State your intentions, and then give me a quick death, it whispered, eyes hollow with exhaustion. It had understood the situation. Hunters tracking it, fighters who'd left it no room to resist. The infant-faced Giozzi, whose eyes betrayed a colder intelligence, seemed to be the leader. The Wendigo suspected the worst. Some ritual, some scheme that would use its life for a darker purpose. Having suffered so much already, pain, torment, forced awakenings, it had reached the point where resistance felt impossible. Better to end than to endure more. Giozzi looked at Chris with a slight frown, puzzled by how suddenly compliant the Wendigo had become. Chris, too, was intrigued. He could see the storm of conflicting thoughts behind the creature's calm face. The emotional turmoil didn't match the outward resignation. That disparity gave him unexpected new ideas about how his psychic powers worked, the way inner chaos could be quieted without changing the underlying struggle. Just answer the question, the Wendigo snapped, on the edge of breaking again. Say what you want and do it. Giozzi blinked. The Wendigo's agitation had startled him. He smoothed his clothes, tried to look official, then leaned forward and asked gently, You're from another world, aren't you? I remember seeing you there. You weren't gentle. What happened? What changed your basic nature so completely that you're now acting against your own foundation? The Wendigo stared, genuinely confused. What? Other world? What do you mean? The creature didn't understand the notion of a different version of itself in another place. Jiaozi watched its perplexed expression and sighed. Never mind, he shrugged. This one's just an accident of world interaction. It doesn't even know why its origins shifted. Then you'll owe me for that answer, Chris said immediately, dropping the deer head back where it lay and turning to Jiaozi. You promised the equipment. I expect no less. He began to rattle off the specifics of Astartes' gear, listing plates, servos, and armaments in meticulous detail. The two figures and the dog faded into the cave's mouth, their conversation trailing after them. Behind them, the Wendigo sat in a puddle of its own regrown flesh, bewildered and trembling. What the hell is going on? It muttered to itself, voice thin in the damp dark. 103. Hurricane Rescue? The Hummer growled as it tore out of the winding mountain forest. Inside the roomy cabin, Jiaozi, Dumpling, let out a long sigh. Why is the Wendigo, so ferocious by nature, so tame in this world? What's its origin pattern? I really want to understand it. Brian waved away the jargon with a hand. If it had been something literary, he might have joined the conversation. But the abstruse scientific terms Jiaozi spouted were pure noise to him, so he kept quiet. Chris, who'd inherited Peter's spectacularly simple-minded approach to things, surprised everyone by following the thread. He peered at Jiaozi, then offered, You said the two worlds had a brief quantum entanglement. Maybe the Wendigo is a sample our world made using the other side's information? That's not impossible, Jiaozi murmured, head bowed in thought. The Wendigo's personality and origin were so warped that it did feel like something their world had deliberately cultivated, making the normal abnormal and the abnormal normal. That fit the world's twisted logic. Jiaozi started to dig deeper into the idea. After all, the birth of this universe was tied to him somehow. He knew the what and the when, but not the why or the how. He knew his essence had changed after he set the universe in motion and that he had authorities he didn't understand, but he didn't know how to use them or where they came from. A chance to study the world's laws was rare, and he was eager. Before Jiaozi could follow the thread much further, Brian's phone buzzed and cut him off. What was I just thinking about? He muttered. Chris snatched the phone away and scolded the backseat occupant. Stewie, take your fingers out of your mouth. There's a ton of germs on them. Jiaozi ignored him. He peered at the little holographic projection hovering in front of him, feeling as if he'd forgotten something important. He glanced at it twice, decided it was only some odd cosmic fluctuation, and shut it off, too lazy to waste more brain power. Chris answered the call. On the other end came a rough, urgent voice. Brian, hurry, save me. They grabbed Patty and the others. It's almost my turn. Megan? Chris said, surprised. He'd never heard Megan's voice over the phone. It sounded unexpectedly deep. Chris, Megan cried out, then the voice went on in a rush. We're in Paris. A group of men barged into our room and snatched Patty and the others. The hotel. The call clipped off mid-sentence. Through the line came faint, chaotic sounds. Megan struggling, three men's heavy breathing, and the rapid heartbeat of whoever held the phone. Chris's face hardened. He was about to bark orders when the back seat erupted in its usual non-sequiturs. From behind him, Jiaozi suddenly piped up into the mouthpiece, as if replying to the kidnappers. I don't know who you are or what you want, but I really don't have any special powers and I can't find you. I do have $2 and a child's watch. You can take either one. Brian stared at Jiaozi with a look that could have blackened his soul. Chris just gaped. Of all moments, what nonsense was this? There was no time to slap sense into him. Chris cut to the point before whoever held the line could hang up. Her heart's in her head, he said flatly. Don't hit her head hard. The call went dead the instant he finished. Chris exhaled a long, shaky breath. If those men checked her chest and found no heart, he hoped telling them that would stop them from panicking and doing something worse. What are you two doing? Brian exploded. Megan's being held. Do you want to lose her before we even get there? Driving will be too slow, Brian added, hands tight on the wheel. We need to get to an airport. Where's the nearest motorcycle in West Virginia? Compared to Brian's frantic energy, Chris and Jiaozi were unnervingly calm. Chris had a sardonic half-smile for Jiaozi. "Where'd you pick up that line just now? You sounded like Peter. Did he possess you or something?" Jiaozi flushed, embarrassed. "Don't tease. Do I really sound that much like him?" Chris coughed and tried not to sound like he was complimenting the imitation. Meanwhile, Brian fished out a map and drove with one eye on it, swearing under his breath. "That's my sister. Do you two not care at all?" Chris tried to reason it out. "Even if we drove flat out to Paris, it'd still be at least a day. No point getting hysterical now. Besides," he fumbled for the words, and what came out sounded both crude and confused. "With Megan's looks, do you think anyone would actually be interested in her? There's no way anyone would buy her." Brian jammed on the brakes and gaped. "You actually think that?" Chris blinked. "What? Isn't that obvious? Kidnappers go for profit, organ buyers, trafficking." "Oh my God, are you serious?" Brian slapped the steering wheel. "Chris, do you even know there are groups that hunt people and get off on torturing them?" Chris went quiet. He'd assumed the situation would play out like the familiar movie plot he'd half remembered. A dramatic rescue, some blustering heroics, a neat happy ending. But the timeline of this universe had already been shattered. Reality might have taken any number of dark turns. The thought sobered him instantly. He lunged for the map, palms trembling. Okay. Tell me where we are now, and get on the fastest route. I don't want to have to try reattaching parts later. I'll puke if I have to do that." 104. Hostel. "Mark, what's going on?" The man who had shoved Megan into a sack asked his companion, who had just hung up the phone. Mark, a broad-shouldered man with a heavy beard, glanced at him, remembered what had been said, and replied with a shrug. "Nothing, just a couple of lunatics." That answer seemed to satisfy the man enough that he stopped pressing. Instead, he started accounting for their haul. 5 young women in total, he said. "But most of them are too ugly even to make dolls out of. They'll only fetch the cheapest price. If it weren't for that Lamborghini they were driving, we'd have come away with nothing." Mark's eyelids lowered at the complaint. Anger flickered inside him. This man had been chafing at his authority for some time, always looking for a chance to undermine him and blame him for slim profits. Mark scanned the rest of the crew and saw the same tacit discontent mirrored on their faces. He'd guessed right. The other 4 men in the 5-man team were seriously disappointed with this catch. Their business was brutal and simple: human trafficking, organ sales, occasional robbery, and jewelry theft when it paid. Their main product, however, was people, bound for torture, ornamental dolls, or worse. Before this job, their target had been another group: young, attractive backpackers with no local ties, the sort that sold well to clients. Compared to them, these women were far less valuable. Mark had taken a gamble because he saw Megan and her friends spending freely and driving a high-end Lamborghini. He figured the car and belongings would make it worth the risk. Once he proposed the idea, the others had eagerly agreed. Only after the operation did they discover how wrong they'd been. Besides Megan, who had a few $1,000s in cash, the other 4 women had barely any money. The shiny Lamborghini, even if fenced, would only bring in a few tens of thousands, far less than they'd expected. The men bit back curses. If they'd stuck to the original plan, they'd at least have the organization's minimum guarantee. Now they were left with a poor payout and women whose value was low. Mark breathed deeply and forced himself to sound decisive. "What are you all rushing for? The other group hasn't left. We can take them tonight." "Humph, easy for you to say," Thorne sneered. "Those guys are out hiking. Who knows if they'll be back?" Grumbling and distrust had been seeping through the team since Mark's gamble. To hold on to his position, he needed to calm them and secure enough profit to erase his mistake. He cut Thorne off with a shout. "Enough, Thorne. I'm the captain." Before Thorne could answer, Mark laid out a plan. "These ones aren't unsellable. This one," he pointed at Megan's sack, "and the 3 other plain ones go to the torture department. The one with the better figure, decapitate her and send her head to the doll department. We can make up some of the losses that way." Thorne's face flickered at the suggestion. Then he fell silent. It wasn't a brilliant solution, but it was something. Not as profitable as they'd hoped, but not disastrous. Mark added that he had another operation in the works that could make up the difference. Thorn, sensing the tide was against him, smartly shut up. Mark looked at the rest of the men. Their silence told him the little rebellion had been quelled, for now. "All right," he said. "No objections. Get this fat pig out of here." Thorn was the first to grab Megan and head for the exit. The others fell into line without protest. 10 minutes later, they were in the warehouse that served as the organization's headquarters, part prison, part slaughterhouse. Mark and his crew unloaded the women according to the plan. They sold some, processed others, and then took the remaining team to the residence of the group they had been originally trailing. What Mark had missed or chosen to ignore was Chris's warning. Whether he had forgotten it or dismissed it as nonsense, that mistake would cost him later. In a dim, fetid room used for storage and experimentation, Megan slowly came back to herself inside the sack. The men had been careless. After knocking her out, they hadn't bound her hands or feet. They had simply dropped her into the bag and tossed it on the floor. Because of that negligence, and because Megan's body bore an oddness they failed to notice, she was able to wriggle free once she regained consciousness. She moved with all the stealth of someone trying not to attract attention. One by one, she opened the sacks stacked around the room, calling softly as she checked each one. "Beth? Patty? Are you here?" The deeper she searched, the more a cold dread settled into her chest. The small warehouse was a slaughterhouse masquerading as storage. Corpses hung in rows from the rafters, swinging gently in the meager light that seeped in from the corridor. Whiplashes and burns marred skin. Limbs were severed and piled in buckets. Faces were mutilated, eyes gouged out, noses sliced away, empty, bloody sockets staring blindly. The stench and the sight of bodies cut and altered sent a chill through Megan that numbed her with horror and then burned into furious resolve. She found 3 of her friends. Beth and 2 others, alive, groggy, frightened, tore the breath from her in a sob. Relief flared for a moment, but it was raw and incomplete. One of them was still missing, Patty. When Megan realized Patty wasn't among them, her mind went white with panic. A dozen terrible possibilities crowded in. Tortured, dismembered, sold off to the worst bidders. She couldn't stand the thought. Without stopping to wake the others properly, she grabbed an iron hook from a nearby hanging corpse. Old, rusted, the kind of crude tool left around here like a utensil, and darted toward the door. "Patty!" she called, voice cracking with desperation. "Please, don't let anything have happened to you." Inside the human skin inn, the operating room looked less like a surgical theater and more like a slaughterhouse. Grimy, slick with blood, the air heavy with iron and smoke. 2 burly men, dressed in blood-streaked aprons, stood over Patty on the table. They smoked and bantered like workmen on a lunch break. "It's a shame," one sighed, fingers tracing the curve of Patty's face. "This perfect body paired with this ugly face, what a waste." "Don't mourn for it," the other scoffed. "No matter how pretty she looks, here she's just meat. Sooner or later, someone will ruin her." The first man finished his cigarette, exhaled slowly, then said, "Better than this hideous head taking up space on such a prize. But none of that matters. The buyer only wants the body. He doesn't care about the face." They laughed. The second man slid a mask over his face and handed a large axe to his partner. Pressing the blade against Patty's neck, he said, "Let's get to it. 3 more toys need trimming before tonight's shipment." The masked man spat, pulled his own mask down, and took the axe. He raised it to swing when a roar echoed from the corridor. "Patty!" Both men froze, exchanged wary looks, and glanced toward the door. Seeing nothing, they squared their shoulders to continue. Before they could move, the iron door burst inward with a crash. Something huge and misshapen slammed through, knocking 2 of their already processed victims, limbless, flattened pieces of flesh, against the wall. The intruder's entrance was a torrent of violence. In an instant, the 2 butchers reacted with frightening synchrony. One brought his axe down on the other's head, blood geysered from the skull. He barely flinched, snatching a scalpel and lunging it toward his partner's eyes. The attacker with the axe felt nothing either. Hands moved like a single organism. A wrist twisted, a skull cap was pried open, and brains were exposed to the matted hair and blood. The man on the receiving end gripped the scalpel with both hands and, with a sound like tearing leather, traced a circumferential cut around the other's temple, leaving only a thin strip of bone over the nasal bridge. Even that small hinge was ripped away after another blow, and both their heads lay split, their brains fragmented. Megan didn't watch their gore with idle curiosity. Her limbs, grotesquely elongated from earlier mutation, reached for Patty. She cradled Patty's head and sobbed quietly, trembling until she realized Patty was alive. Relief flooded her. As her fury subsided, her body shrank back towards something more human. That didn't mean she was done with the men who'd tried to harm her friend. She yanked the axe from one butcher's broken skull and stalked from the operating room, rage shadowing her face. She wanted them to pay. In the hotel's auction hall, the evening's entertainment was beginning. The host stood on the podium, smooth and practiced as ever, making the usual rounds of theatrical patter to boost the price of tonight's merchandise. Bound and gagged, a sack covering their head, the item on offer thrashed against their restraints. Nervous titters and eager eyes sparkled in the crowd. The host cleared his throat and reached for the placard. He never got to read it. An ugly girl in rags and a pink knitted hat climbed the stage, an axe in her hand. The host blinked, uncertain, then scolded, "Sir, you bought a package. You're supposed to stay in your room. Bringing a weapon into the hall will scare the guests." Megan's smile was small and hard. The host continued nervously, "We'll let it slide this time. You must be a new customer. Next time, though, there's a fine." The patrons erupted in knowing laughter. Here, fines were meaningless. Everyone in the room could pay away any penalty and still walk out with a comfortable surplus. The host's words had been a reassurance to their lawless appetites. Megan swung the axe. The host's chest split like a rotten fruit. The hall fell into a stunned, suspended silence, then pitched into panic. The security team moved as protocol demanded, but protocol had no answer for the girl who moved like a blade. Two guards' heads flew from their shoulders before anyone could brace. Screams drowned out the clamor of boots on stone. The auction floor turned into a scene of frantic violence. In minutes, it was a morgue of scattered limbs and red-smudged flooring, blood spraying and pooling in patterned, cruel designs. Megan's motions were methodical, almost clinical. She cut with an efficiency that made it impossible to mistake the resemblance. If there was a family craft, it was brutal and thorough. She was Louise's daughter all too plainly, the same cold hand at the end of a bloody trade. When the last of the most dangerous survivors lay still, Megan walked to the podium and lifted the sack from the captive's head. "You," she breathed. Thorne stared up at her, confusion and terror warring on his face. How could the little girl they'd trust and tossed be the one who'd become such a force? He remembered one thing only. The moment he realized she might live had been the moment he felt truly triumphant. That victory curdled now under Megan's gaze. She stepped closer, axe poised. Thorne shook his head, mouthed useless pleas. Megan didn't lower the weapon. She swung, cleaving a shoulder from its socket and crushing an ankle beneath the haft. She had planned to finish him quickly, but a memory stopped her, a flash of Patty and the other girls, almost subjected to the same torments. She decided instead on a slower sentence, to break him bit by bit, to leave him to a long, quiet slide into death. "Don't worry," she said, almost conversational as she toyed with the ruined joint. "None of your friends will get away. This city isn't big. I'll find them, one by one, and do for them what I'm doing for you." Hearing that, Thorne's fury dimmed, his resistance ebbing. The terror he felt made the physical pain recede in an odd relief. Megan felt the scene flatten into dullness. With a short, efficient motion, she ended him, and his breathing stopped as his head met the floor. Megan stood amid the ruin she'd wrought and felt nothing like victory, only the cold, slow wash of a task completed. Patty leaned into her, trembling but alive. Outside, the city's night carried on, unaware of the new trail that had been carved through the dark. Megan pulled the axe free of the floor, tucked it under her arm, and set her jaw. There were more to find. There was more to do. 106, arriving late Paris airport. "Hey, sirs, need a tour guide? I'm a pro. I can show you all the best spots to relax." A man with a thick accent called out, stopping Chris and the others as they stepped off the plane. Brian glanced at Chris, eyes searching for approval. Chris felt the man's eagerness and shook his head. "Let's move. He's just a small-time guide who rips off tourists. He's not the kind to get into kidnapping." Cradling Jowsy, Dumpling, in one arm, Chris walked past the stunned guide. The man had seen enough of the city to know its darker trades, but he wasn't local enough or bold enough to escalate to real crime, only the occasional gray deal selling information. As Chris moved away, the guide tapped his phone and dialed an old contact, speaking rapidly in his native tongue to describe what he'd seen. He wanted someone to start tracking them. A few rings later, a cool voice answered. A big guy carrying an infant and a dog-like intelligent creature. Sounds like Chris and his group have arrived. It was Megan. The night before, after storming the human skin inn, she had cleared out a small organization and been combing through the hotel's transaction records. As eldest daughter of the Griffin family, punishing those who dared cross them was part of the job. She had only just finished cleaning up when this call came through, and she recognized Chris instantly. "Who are you? Where's Sambun?" The tour guide blurted in panic, his words tripping over his accent. Before Megan could reply, a large hand snatched the phone from him, wrenching it free and crushing his palm. The pain drove the guide to his knees with a howl. Curiously, no one else in the terminal seemed to notice. Chris had already activated his psychic influence, making the crowd avert their attention. "Hi, Megan," Chris said softly into the receiver. He kept his voice low so the surrounding people would stay oblivious. If the guide had waited until Chris had climbed into a taxi, the call would have missed her entirely. On the other end, Megan listened, then with the same quiet steadiness she used in a fight, said, "There are still a few left here. Want to join in?" Chris almost said no. He wasn't interested in slaughtering ordinary people. But Jiaozi looked up at him with bright, eager eyes, and Chris couldn't refuse. "Give me the location," he said. "Stewie is very interested in this kind of thing." They went straight to the address. Back at the airport, the tour guide's condition rapidly worsened. Chris's ability to attract misfortune had marked him. Airport security later reported the man died from stool that had fallen from an aircraft. The autopsy notes puzzled the investigators. His palm was shattered as if crushed under a roller, but with the man an undocumented immigrant and the airline unwilling to draw attention, the case was quietly closed. When Chris and Megan finally met at the scene, they found a hotel room where 4 terrified women huddled together. Megan loomed over them, an aura of cold menace. Brian, ever the lesher, spotted Patty and, without thinking, moved to step forward. Megan saw it instantly. Her expression snapped hard, and with a single violent shove, she sent Brian flying into the corner of the room. He hit the wall on his back and went still. The women stared in confusion, not understanding what their savior was doing. With Chris standing there, handsome, imposing, and clearly capable, the women pivoted. Relief and gratitude washed over them, and they surged toward him like moths to a lamp. "Oh, Chris, thank you for saving us. I was so terrified. That place was hell. There were limbs everywhere. I can't imagine what kind of monsters did that." They crowded him, each voice trying to outdo the others with praise and sympathy. But Megan only grew darker. The gruesome visions those women described, the dismemberments and torture, weren't scenes they'd actually witnessed inside the separate cubicles. They were the aftermath of Megan's own work. Hearing them call her a butcher in the same breath as pleading for comfort stung. Her hands clenched. Megan shoved the women back, furious. "Get away from my brother, you sluts," she spat. Still bewildered, the women were forced into a bedroom and locked in until Megan cooled down. With that mess handled, Chris looked at Megan and asked, steady and calm, "What else needs doing? What do you want me to do?" Megan's gaze turned icy, hatred barely contained in her voice. "Wipe them out." Hearing the murder in Megan's voice, Chris guessed this had to have been a terrible trauma for her. Megan had been tempered by the Griffins for years. She didn't fly off the handle like this without reason. Maybe it was because those men had endangered her friends. Whatever the cause, if Megan wanted them dead, Chris, as her younger brother, intended to give her what she wanted. Instead of going after each of them personally, Chris found a computer and let Jiaozi work his tech magic. With a few keystrokes, Jiaozi's advanced tools located everyone connected to the human skin inn. When the list filled the screen, even Megan, who'd already cleared a hotel single-handedly, stilled. "Oh my God, there are 3 of these hotels in Paris alone? That's insane." Jiaozi moved quickly, pulling up personnel files. Megan scanned them and felt her stomach drop. 3,000 people? How long will it take to kill all of them? She muttered. Was her whole summer vacation going to be spent chasing perverts? Chris chuckled. You're being too inefficient. Let me show you what efficiency looks like. Megan and Jiaozi stared at him. Huh? What are you talking about? Megan asked. Jiaozi blanked for a beat, then grinned. Don't be an idiot. Stellaris hasn't come out for another dozen years. Consider the historical context. Chris blinked, then laughed, embarrassed. Sorry, I don't play that game. Too much thinking. Jiaozi wanted to keep teasing, but Megan snapped. Enough. What are you two jabbering about? I want them dead right now. Do you understand how I feel? Both guys wisely shut up. It was clear Megan had been pushed past the limit. Better not to rile her further. Chris started cross-referencing the files and began applying his bad luck ability to the people on the list. He caught Jiaozi's eye. Jiaozi understood and pulled up the nearest surveillance feed. Megan saw the footage and spat. There, he's the one who brought people to kidnap me and Patty. Jiaozi smirked. Well behaved, he said. The camera showed a sleepy Mark getting out of bed, heading for the bathroom. He stepped on the metal buckle of his carelessly discarded belt. Oh fuck, he cursed. Megan snorted. That's your efficiency? Keep watching, Jiaozi said, amused. He'd seen Chris's power before. Chris added, the ability is spread too thin when you apply it to thousands. It needs time to build up. Chris bumped up Mark's priority. The unlucky chain started. Mark limped into the bathroom, then the shower suddenly blasted water. In his panic, he slipped, hitting his head against the toilet wall with a sickening thud. Shit, he swore, trying to get up. Every attempt was clumsy and doomed. His arm slipped, his face smashed against porcelain again. Chris felt annoyed. This many targets diluted the effect and made an instant kill harder. He raised the priority again. The bathroom lights flickered. The ceiling panel gave way. A live power cable plunged into the toilet. Sparks hissed in the dim shower. A few seconds later, Chris let out a breath. Okay, he's done. Over the next stretch, he told Megan, everyone involved in your kidnapping will die one by one. Don't worry. Because his bad luck field had been spread out at first, their deaths wouldn't be immediate. Instead, they'd suffer escalating misfortune until accidents finally took them. As targets fell off the list, the rest would receive proportionally worse luck. Chris estimated that in less than 3 months, the several thousand people would all be dead, each by accident, no exceptions. Megan's expression, which had been hard and controlled, softened as relief, and the promise of vengeance washed through her. Chris relaxed along with her until she suddenly pointed at Jiaozi's screen. There's no way there's surveillance in a hotel bathroom, she said. How did you get footage of him in there? Both brothers turned to Jiaozi. He went pale, clearly rattled by the attention. Megan's voice hardened. Are you lying to me? At her tone, Jiaozi looked like he'd been physically struck. Chris felt oddly exposed too, as if an invisible pressure bore down on him and his muscles weakened. Then Jiaozi rushed an answer out, trying to steady the room. Signal manipulation. This wristband can control nearby electromagnetic signals. The moment passed. The strange weight lifted, and the world snapped back to normal as Megan's glare eased and Jiaozi's explanation filled the air. 108. Shock and Shock, West Virginia Airport. I still don't get why you're so scared of Megan. Just confront her. Chris said, tugging Jiaozi and Brian toward the parking lot. Their Hummer was still parked there. Jiaozi snorted. You don't understand. Yahweh sealed her away for a reason. I don't want to mess with that and risk releasing her. Cleaning up that mess would be impossible. He hadn't fully come to terms with his own powers, and the idea of facing an old god, or whatever Megan really was, filled him with dread. He never wanted to see that twisted, nauseating sight again. Chris listened without changing expression, but his mind froze for a moment. The implications of Jiaozi's words hit him hard. God had actually appeared, and Megan's existence was tied to that divine action. Suddenly, Chris's whole plan for this summer trip felt careless and reckless. He'd known from videos before the crossover that God existed in this world and that Jesus occasionally appeared in Yuan Ha Town, but that knowledge had been abstract, screened through third-hand footage. Up close, separated by countless differences between worlds, the reality looked completely different. In Chris's old impression, God had seemed like an eccentric prankster. Now, hearing that Megan was the sealed remnant of an old god, he had to rethink everything. Chris shook Brian awake. The dog had been out cold since Megan knocked him out yesterday, and even Chris's slaps couldn't stir him. Chris dripped a few drops of dragon blood potion into Brian's mouth. What's going on? Did you find Megan?" Brian mumbled as his eyes blinked open, still foggy. His memories were stuck on searching for Megan. Chris filled him in quickly about what had happened while he was unconscious, then said gravely, "Let's go home. I'm done with this trip." Brian was about to ask for more when he noticed the odd mood in the car. Jiaozi watching with a faint smile like he wanted to see how it would play out, and Chris looking unusually unsettled. Whatever had happened while he slept was something he hadn't seen. The dragon blood potion kicked in, sharpening Brian's body and mind. In an instant, he decided to follow Chris's lead without arguing. They drove back to the Griffin place. As they pulled up, an awkward, utterly mortifying sound met them from the garage. "Oh, Peter, your soft flesh tickles me. Ha!" Louise's shriek cut through the air. The two men and the dog exchanged glances, and for once made a sensible choice. They slipped away from the Griffin house. On the curb across the street, the three watched in stunned silence while the noises from the house continued to assault them. After a few unbearable minutes, Chris couldn't take it any longer. He stood. Brian hoped he would storm in and stop whatever grotesque display was going on. But Chris didn't go in. He cleared his throat, embarrassed, and said, "Ahem, Stewie, you still remember that piece of equipment you promised me? Can you build it now?" "Yeah, sure," Jiaozi said quickly, flushing as if the line of conversation had saved his dignity. He climbed into Chris's arms, and Chris hopped up to the second-floor window. They slipped inside, cutting through the awkwardness and retreating to Jiaozi's basement. Brian lingered by the house a moment longer, listening, then finally left when he couldn't stand it. He decided to drown his irritation at the bar. As he walked past Quagmire's place, he saw the red-eyed man staring with white heat at the Griffin house, as if his greatest enemy were trapped behind those doors. Brian paused, then called out, "Hey, Quagmire, I'm heading to the bar. Want to come?" Quagmire rubbed his jaw, eyes still fixed on the house, and after a beat muttered, "Wait for me." So the two despondent men headed to the Yuanha bar together. A few blocks away, old Joe crammed a sandwich into his mouth and watched Bonnie doing prenatal exercises. He sighed and said, "Tsk, it's taking too long." Bonnie, a little out of breath, turned and asked, puzzled, "Joe, what's taking too long?" Joe popped open a drink and said, "Never mind, I'm heading to the police station." "Okay, be careful," Bonnie said softly. "I know," Joe grumbled, then left, exasperated. He liked his quiet life too much to waste it. Back at Jiaozi's base, the mood was heavy. Neither Chris nor Jiaozi joked around like usual. Louise and Peter's earlier performance had driven home a blunt, embarrassing truth. No matter how powerful or respected they might be elsewhere, in the Griffin house, they were still the sons of Peter and Louise. The image of two capable young men reduced to children in the face of their parents' inappropriate behavior felt absurd. After a long, awkward silence, Chris, playing the more mature role, broke it. I want to build a blast gun, preferably one with infinite ammo. Think you can do it?" Jiaozi, still half haunted by Louise's screams and Peter's grotesque laughter, snapped back to reality. Yeah, I can do that." He walked to his workbench without another word and began assembling pieces with methodical focus. 109. The Abnormality of Dumplings. After some very orc-like and completely unscientific procedures, in Chris's opinion, a sci-fi gun perfectly sized for his hand was thrust into him. He turned the new toy over in his grip. Skeptical that it was the same kind of blast gun the Astartes carried, its construction was too vague. Still, the new object distracted him from wondering about Peter and Louise pulling radishes. Dumpling, however, was still dazed and couldn't pull himself together. Chris tucked the blast gun into his wristband and went to the control panel. With the press of a button, a portal opened in the wall. After stepping through, he found himself in a vast testing chamber. Dumpling had created to evaluate weapons and gauge Chris's strength. It was a good place to get a feel for the blast gun. Chris and Dumpling had very different understandings of tech, and who knew whether Dumpling had slipped some of his private enhancements into this weapon during manufacture. In Warhammer lore, the blast gun's power varies with ammo, and its top end is only comparable to a grenade launcher, not something universe-warping. But if Dumpling had turbocharged it, Chris needed to know how much firepower he was holding. He raised the gun, aimed at a solid steel block several meters across, eased his finger to the trigger, and fired. A recoil that would have shattered an ordinary person slammed into him, then was effortlessly absorbed by his body. The steel block exploded in a deafening roar, blown to fragments. The crater left behind was nearly a meter deep, big enough for Chris to curl up in. He nodded to himself. Dumpling had definitely boosted the thing. In universe terms, achieving that kind of output without activating a machine spirit or a chaos god's blessing was extraordinary, but here those rules didn't apply. Satisfied, Chris slipped the blast gun back into his wristband. He planned to learn better marksmanship, maybe even the legendary gun kata, and then show off properly. Right now, the weapon's power still didn't exceed what he could do with a casual punch. He chuckled and left the testing room to check on Dumpling. Dumpling sat there looking lost, utterly dim-witted in a way that made Chris uneasy. He'd always thought Dumpling knew a thing or two about male-female matters. He'd even egged Chris on into mischief with Bonnie once, so seeing him knocked sideways by Peter and Luis's antics made Chris suspect scheming. But the situation felt deeper than simple embarrassment. "Hey, Stewie, are you all right?" Chris asked, placing a hand on Dumpling's forehead and reaching out with his psychic calming ability. When his consciousness slipped into Dumpling's mind, Chris found a mental landscape as vast as a starry sky, and he couldn't find Dumpling's core consciousness anywhere. That trick didn't work. Chris withdrew and sat cross-legged in front of him, taking a different tack. "All right, brother, look at me." He wrenched Dumpling upright, forced him to meet his gaze, and said seriously, "Tell me, what's wrong? Can I help?" External, direct communication produced a flicker of response. A distant light returned to Dumpling's vacant eyes. His lips trembled. "Absurd, void, meaningless. The world was born because of me, but I don't want this world," he muttered. With each word, Chris's expression hardened. By the time Dumpling finished, his face had gone dead serious. He didn't know the exact mechanics, but with his analytical mind and wide-ranging knowledge, he pieced together a likely explanation. Either the jolt of Megan's ancient god essence or a shock from Peter's bestial strength had agitated something deep inside Dumpling, pushing the divine aspect of his nature to the fore and smothering the human side. He couldn't fix Dumpling's humanity directly, not with his current power. But Chris was a transmigrator, and those who transmigrate carry a lot of information across worlds, skills, memories, and tricks that can sometimes bend the impossible. He'd seen someone lose their humanity and slowly regain it through experience. There were indirect routes he could try. Chris hugged Dumpling tight and, with more hope than certainty, pleaded, "Transmigrate. No matter the world, take my brother with me." It was the first time he'd actively used his transmigration ability since awakening it. Before, his jumps had been forced or triggered by Dumpling's tech. He'd never deliberately requested one like this. He didn't know if his will would translate into action. But as he felt the connection form and the environment around them begin to shift, relief flooded him. The ability could be used that way. He patted Dumpling and tried to sound light. "I don't know if this will work, but the old man next door regained his humanity through adventures with his grandson. My options are limited, so all I can do is try desperate measures and hope it helps you too." Chris stared into Dumpling's eyes. The spark of intelligence wasn't brighter, but it also hadn't gone colder. That was enough to convince him his gamble had a chance. A new world was coming into being around them. Chris slung Dumpling onto his shoulder and stepped out of the filthy alley, ready to see where the transmigration had taken them, and to do whatever it took to wake his odd little companion back up. On the noisy, crowded streets, Chris scanned his surroundings. From his past trips between worlds, the places he landed were usually close to where the story he had jumped into was played out. If he could find something familiar, he could quickly figure out which world he was in. He compared the scene to the memories in his head, but nothing fit. It took a few landmark buildings before he could be sure. This was Chicago. From people's clothing and snippets of conversation, he estimated the year to be roughly 2008. That information didn't help much with his real goal, raising Jiaozi's dumplings' humanity, but it was something. After a moment's thought, Chris decided to feed Jiaozi first. At least their stomachs could be filled. While Chris watched the city, something in this world watched him back. A special being, less a living creature than a rule-given shape, yet dependent on human worship, sensed Chris and registered a kindred aura, a fate-tied presence connected to death. For that being, it was a tantalizing prize, a shortcut toward power that might as well be a stepping stone to godhood. It made its choice in an instant. It would devour this kindred spirit. Far away, in a thread-filled warehouse, an ancient loom of fate creaked to life. Click, clack. In the hush of the storage room, the loom began to weave on its own. The only human in the warehouse snapped to attention. He drew a pistol and crept toward the machine, every instinct primed. "Cross, is that you?" Sloane called, voice low and guarded. He moved with the caution of someone who had once been hunted by the Brotherhood's deadliest assassin. There was no reply. Sloane didn't relax. He held his breath, flooded his body with adrenaline, and pushed his heart rate up until his pulse hammered past 300 beats a minute. In his younger years, he might have pushed beyond 400. Now his muscles and nerves were taxed by age and years of enhancement. 300 was his limit. He stalked the warehouse, searching for any sign of the assassin. After circling the looms and crates, he realized he had been imagining an ambush. The Brotherhood's former champion had not infiltrated the area. All that remained was the loom, working itself, and the printed human profile lying on its output tray. Sloane stared at the portrait the machine had spat out. Emotions crashed through him, shock, panic, a flare of regret, but those quickly sharpened into something colder. Resolve. He had spent his life improving his own position, issuing orders that sent innocents to their deaths, even twisting the Brotherhood's ancient rules to suit his ambitions. All of that had been possible because, as far as he had always believed, there were no gods to punish him. But the loom before him proved the old legends were real. He had shown up on the loom's list in the past. He had told himself that was bureaucratic noise, a superstition he could exploit. He had even tampered with those binary-coded commands himself, and later issued orders under the loom's name when it suited him. Decades of getting away with it had convinced Sloane that fate was a myth and the ancients fools. Now the loom was weaving the impossible, and Sloane felt the needle of guilt pricking at him. He was not about to repent. He fished out a lighter and stepped forward. "I don't know if I'll burn in hell when I die," he said into the empty room, "but right now, you don't have the power to kill me. I'll live out my life in peace." As he spoke, more words appeared beneath the portrait, clear, deliberate text arranged by the loom itself. "Find him, kill him, bring his body to me, and I will erase all your past sins." Sloane's hands went numb for a moment. In the past, the loom's outputs had always required binary conversion and interpretation. They were indirect, not so bluntly transactional. That indirectness had been his proof that fate was a sham. He had manipulated those messages more than once to his advantage and paid no price. But now the loom's tone was brazen and self-interested. From those few words, Sloane drew a sudden, cold conclusion. The loom had its own motives. Then he started thinking in the only practical way he knew. What could he gain? "Why should I listen to you?" Sloane said coolly, tucking the lighter away. "The Brotherhood spent 1,000 years following your directions and lived in hardship. The years I defied you were the Brotherhood's strongest. Why should I obey now?" The loom's clacking stopped. Sloane pressed the point, but human complexity baffled the mechanism. It responded with the one-sentence bait that spoke directly to his weakness. "You don't have much time left. Bring his body, and I can give you a longer life." Sloane's pupils tightened. He was a master at reading people and situations, but the loom had hit his soft spot. He was old. Enhancements kept him functional, but couldn't add endless years. His assassin training had burned chunks of his lifespan away. The offer of more years was irresistible. He let out a bitter chuckle. "You should have told me this earlier," he muttered to himself. "I never would have betrayed you if I'd known I could buy my life." The loom didn't reply. Its human followers were not limited to Sloane's branch. Prudence required it summon others as well. Sloane, without hesitation, copied the portrait onto a scrap of paper, then tried to decode whatever hidden signal might be embedded within it. He ran a binary conversion on the image, searching for a name or clue about the boy who had appeared on the loom's page. He found nothing. The loom had printed only the face, no metadata, no instructions beyond those blunt words. Sloane folded the paper, the gears in his mind already turning. The promise of renewed life was a dagger that could buy him anything. He just needed the chance to collect the one thing the loom wanted. 111. Arrest warrant. Chris wandered the crowded metropolis carrying Giozzi in his arms. He had no idea he'd become a target for some of the locals. If he had, he guessed, he would have been surprised for all of 5 seconds, then tracked the person down, killed them, and taken whatever strange power they possessed. You probably haven't tried goat's milk, have you? Here, try some. Chris grinned and tipped a bottle of goat's milk into Giozzi's mouth to see what would happen. With his fragile sense of humanity, Giozzi didn't stop him. He let the gamey milk spill in, then immediately let out a high-pitched wah and vomited copiously. Pedestrians nearby gagged and moved away, covering their mouths and noses. A few elderly folk frowned, and an old woman, unable to stand it, shuffled over and demanded, "What are you doing? Are you this child's family? Don't you know he's allergic to this stuff?" Chris looked up. His imposing presence made the old woman take a step back, but she kept watching him with concern. Seeing that she meant well, Chris didn't get angry. He smiled and explained, "He's my little brother. He ate something he shouldn't have, so I'm helping him throw it up." Those words reassured her. She inspected Giozzi with concern, and when she saw there were no signs of abuse, she apologized and walked away. After that, Giozzi did seem a little livelier. He wiped vomit from the corner of his mouth and complained, "I'm still a baby. If you want to stimulate my emotional system, can't you be gentler? Like, use love?" Chris's eyes lit up. This was working. "See, isn't this faster? Who knows if all that lovey-dovey nonsense would have left you a heartless machine." Giozzi sneered twice, then in a mildly agitated tone, said, "Heh, I really have to thank you then." "No need," Chris said, feigning ignorance of the sarcasm. "We're brothers." He ruffled Giozzi's dumpling head and smiled. Giozzi wasn't angry. He knew how close he'd come to losing himself, how his humanity had almost dissolved into some cosmic state. In his past life, he'd never faced anything like this, so he'd had no experience. Fortunately, Chris had reacted in time, slowing the fade and even restoring a good deal of what was lost. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a human Stewie now, only a stone man in his body. "What's your situation now? Has it been resolved?" Chris asked, watching Giozzi closely. Chris couldn't probe Giozzi with his mental power, so he had to guess from his expressions. Giozzi's eyes warmed at the concern, but because he still couldn't display much feeling, he explained in a calm voice. "To put it in terms you might get, I've withdrawn from the Tao transformation state, but I'm not fully relaxed yet. I need more mental stimulation to bring back my human emotions." From his words alone, Chris could tell Giozzi's emotions were stronger than before. That was a huge relief. If the person was okay, everything else could be worked out. Chris had an idea. Take Giozzi to interesting places, give him external stimuli and new experiences, and his emotional range would grow. It would be like awakening the old man next door. The meaning of life could be found gradually. Since Giozzi's life had only just begun, and he hadn't sunk into the nihilism Rick had, regaining his humanity ought to be easier. "So by mental stimulation, you mean new experiences?" Chris asked. Giozzi nodded. "Exactly. Doing things I haven't done before helps." "Then how about playing with some assassins? Want to try that?" Chris suggested. Giozzi blinked in confusion, then followed Chris's gaze skyward toward a tall building. Through Chris's perception, a scene he'd once found unforgettable was unfolding inside. A man in a suit suddenly shot from the building, shattering glass in a blur too fast for ordinary eyes. Instead of plummeting and dying, the man traced a perfect arc and smashed into another building. Chris stood on the street, heart thudding like an engine, impressed by the dashing spectacle, but grimly aware of the fate that would likely follow. "Around 1,000 years ago," Chris said, watching the scene, A group founded a secret organization that believed in killing one to save thousands. They hid among mortals and quietly influenced human development. In modern times, someone within changed the rules for his own gain, and that put him on a death list. Jiaozi had already guessed the direction after hearing Chris's summary and seeing the dark figure leap between buildings. Was that guy just now one of them? He asked. So fate really exists here? Chris waved off falling glass and then heard gunfire from the top floor and the dying words of the sweeted man. He knew the man was done for. Maybe, but it doesn't matter to us. What I mean is, want to mess around with those assassins? They're all on fate's death list. This world is even called wanted for that reason. Death list? Jiaozi's brows twitched as he looked at Chris meaningfully. Between the clues Chris had given and the phrase death list, he thought of the Shinigami from the Shinigami world. Chris, hearing Jiaozi murmur, paused too, an uneasy thought forming. Damn, Chris muttered internally. Could the fate of this world really be connected to those Shinigami? Chris knew there was a connection between Shinigami and fate. This, however, was another world. He didn't know whether the Shinigami had any influence here. Still, these worlds lay in the same region. There had to be some link. So when Chris sensed something off, he activated his bad luck ability and began searching for this world's strand of fate. The instant he did, a concept similar to the Shinigami world's core of fate appeared in his perception. For a moment it stiffened, as if annoyed by his intrusion, then resumed its work as though nothing had happened. It felt like the fate concept here had deliberately responded to him. Chris compared it with his Shinigami world memories and figured he was probably overthinking. In the Shinigami world, Shinigami attacked him the moment he arrived, and after spending enough time here, it was easy to forget that a world could have a living concept of fate at all, especially when the rules governing those concepts differed between worlds. Still, the Shinigami world had left a deep impression. If Jiaozi, Dumpling, hadn't helped him there, he would have died. Chris's fingers idly flicked at a shard of broken glass as he thought about that, and then his hands stilled when he remembered something else. If not for Jiaozi, he might never have gone to the Shinigami world in the first place. 2 or 3 tiny pieces of glass slipped free and landed on Jiaozi, Dumpling's head. Ah! Ow! Fuck! Jiaozi cried, clutching his scalp and leaning away from the falling shards. Before he could grill Chris apologized without missing a beat. Sorry. I spaced out for a second. Didn't mean for those to fall. Chris moved as if to pat Jiaozi's head, looking contrite and ready to accept whatever scolding came. Jiaozi's anger deflated under the performance. He sulked instead of cursing. But it didn't take long for suspicion to creep back. Chris didn't lose focus for no reason. What happened? He demanded. What stunned you so badly? Chris kept his voice steady. That show-off just died. Shot in the head by a long-range sniper. Miserable death. Really? Jiaozi's interest was immediate. How far? Can you learn that? You want to learn? Chris looked down in surprise. Jiaozi nodded, trying to hide his eagerness with bluster. It'll help me kill Louise, he said offhandedly. Whatever makes you happy, Chris replied, unbothered. He ran the timings in his head, calculated the delay between the crossfire and the man's death, worked out the bullet velocity from known parameters, then gave Jiaozi the results. The shot was from over 5 kilometers. Learning to do that takes specialized training. With my physique, I could fake something, but you'd need a professional instructor. Jiaozi brightened. You know who could teach it, right? I do, Chris said, but he cooled Jiaozi's enthusiasm. He might not want to teach you. You're my big brother. Don't leave me hanging, Jiaozi tried to flatter. Chris felt a touch of smugness watching the usually gruff kid fawn for once. He lifted Jiaozi and ruffled his hair. Don't worry, I know his weakness. I can get you in. Chris had already been too conspicuous. Blocking falling glass in public had drawn attention. To avoid making himself well known in this world, he moved away with Jiaozi before anyone could ask too many questions. Not long after they left, police and ambulance sirens arrived at the scene. The suit-clad man's death had been a big event. Assassin Brotherhood assassins wielded power in this era, and many officials colluded with them. Sloan, having learned of the death, regretted sending X to hunt Cross. If he had known fate itself would interfere, he wouldn't have ordered it. It was too late to second-guess things now, so he put a contingency into motion. "Fox, the plan starts. Bring Wesley back," Sloane ordered. The woman called Fox, tall and striking, rose and left the office. She headed for a location Sloane had already picked. Meanwhile, Chris led Jiaozi into a noisy, run-down residential block. Trains rattled past at intervals. The alley smelled of neglect. The people who lived here were either desperate or dangerous, maybe both. The man they were looking for fit that neighborhood, wiry, unkempt, with an air that could be read as loser or ruthless depending on the angle. Jiaozi eyed the young man and scoffed. "Is that him? How could that loser learn sniping from a top assassin? Is he the assassin's son or something? Have you seen that plotline before?" Chris asked with amused surprise. "No," Jiaozi admitted, "but it's the only thing that makes sense." Chris nodded. "It's true. He's the assassin's son. I won't go into the family drama here. Basically, the assassin handed his boy over to outsiders to be raised because he feared retaliation. So what's the plan?" Jiaozi pressed. "We train this kid, get him confident and brave. Then we orchestrate a reconciliation with his father. A father worried his son will be crippled won't refuse to teach him what he needs to survive." Jiaozi snorted. "You really think that'll work?" "Don't worry," Chris said. "If the father doesn't want his son broken, he'll agree." "Fine," Jiaozi said, half caring, half convinced. He didn't have to want the long-range sniper training as much as he claimed. He just needed a shot at it. 113. Bullet curve. Wesley felt his life was collapsing. At work, he was exploited and humiliated by his mean, bloated boss. At home, he had to endure the cold stares of his hostile girlfriend. His only friend and colleague was a hypocrite, and worse, had cuckolded him, something Wesley had to pretend not to know. Thinking about it all, he sometimes imagined lying down on the railroad tracks next to his house and ending it. He never intended to actually die. He loved his life too much. Even with his meager salary, he spent most of it on medicine to steady himself when the panic got bad. Now he stood at the counter, the medicine bottle between his fingers, staring blankly. The clerk took his card, swiped it, then looked at him apologetically. "Sorry, insufficient funds." Wesley fumbled for his wallet, scraped out a few coins, and handed them over, while the clerk shrugged and moved on to the next customer. He was about to leave when a hand clamped down on the bottle. Wesley looked back and froze. A lithe, striking woman stood that close to him. His breath hitched and his heart hammered. Dizziness prickled at his temples. It felt like the world slowed. Panicked, he twisted open the cap and tipped the pills into his palm, shaking as he brought them to his mouth. A sharp slap across his forearm sent the pills spilling to the floor. What are you doing?" he snapped, flustered, and lunged to grab the bottle again. The woman slapped the bottle out of his hand and then slapped Wesley hard enough to make him steady. "Control it. Accept it. This is your innate talent." Wesley blinked at her in confusion. After 2 more heavy-handed slaps, he felt the panic loosen, the awful pressure ebbing. The world returned to normal speed. "Humph. Who are you? You almost killed me," he gasped. "You can call me Fox. Come back to headquarters with me. We'll tell you everything. Your past, your abilities." Fox grabbed his shoulder and started toward the door. Just as she reached the entrance, she froze, sensing danger. She shoved Wesley aside and whipped her arm up, firing toward the threat. Ding! 2 bullets met in midair with a metallic ping, canceling each other's trajectories before clattering to the floor. Customers ducked for cover. Wesley bolted like everyone else, vanishing from Fox's sight. Fox cursed and sprayed a burst to cover her escape, hunting for him. When the gunplay quieted, Fox found Wesley hiding behind a shelf and reloading. She stomped on him with a high heel to stop him from bolting again. "Stay still." The heel's pressure sent Wesley sprawling and limp on the floor. Blood pounded through his head, and the world slowed again, each second stretching. From his low vantage, he watched Fox win back and swing her pistol. She fired, but the bullet didn't travel straight. It curved in a graceful arc and vanished around the shelf, aimed at an unseen opponent. Wesley stared, stunned. The enemy across from them was alive because he matched Fox's trick. He bent his own round, too. The 2 bullets collided midair and dropped harmlessly to the floor, as they had a moment before. This duel of curved shots left Wesley stunned and a little terrified. Outside, 2 people watched the fight like it was a show. Jiaozi, Dumpling, rode on the shoulder of a man named Chris, eyes wide. Cool. I want to learn marksmanship like that, he said. Chris's expression showed equal hunger. He'd picked Cross as his teacher. Cross was a master of such techniques. If their plan worked, both of them would get what they wanted. When Fox seemed to force back Cross and make for the door with Wesley, Chris moved. He pulled a blast gun and fired, not to kill, but to stop them. He aimed a safe distance from Fox and pulled the trigger. Fox leapt for her sports car with Wesley and slammed across the hood. There was a single enormous blast that turned metal into scrap and carved a deep crater in the asphalt. The car was a mangled wreck. Debris and heat washed over the street. Fox's face darkened with disbelief. Nothing ordinary, a grenade launcher, a normal rocket, would leave a crater like that. Whoever had struck had used lethal, heavy firepower. Terrorists could do it, but in the middle of a bustling city? Fox considered Cross the culprit for a heartbeat, then shook the thought off. She knew the Brotherhood had trouble sourcing such arms. Fox grabbed Wesley and prepared to flee. Before she could, Chris moved faster. In a motion that was almost casual, he extended a finger and flicked the side of her neck. The agile assassin went limp and collapsed beside Wesley. From his perch, Jiaozi clicked his tongue. Tsk, 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 tsk. I knew you had a thing for her. Chris shrugged. Tell me something I don't already know. He'd always liked beautiful women, and after transmigrating and merging in part with Chris's essence, the tendency had only gotten worse. With a practiced lift, he slung Fox over one shoulder and Wesley over the other, set Jiaozi on Fox's lower back, and walked off with brisk, jaunty steps. 114. There is more than one way to persuade. Wesley woke on a clean, soft, enormous bed. He twisted, trying to go back to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, they snapped open. This wasn't his cramped, dilapidated room. His last clear memory before blacking out, the explosion, had nothing to do with this place. Panic flared. He checked his body frantically, afraid he'd died in the blast. Woo, nice body! A whistle sounded beside him. Wesley turned sharply and found himself squinting at a short, round-faced person wrapped in a bath towel, staring at him with an absurdly excited expression. Who are you? Where am I? Wesley demanded. Jiaozi, Dumpling, ignored him and shouted toward the door. Are you done with your business? This guy's awake. Chris walked in a moment later, carrying a pile of clothes. He rolled his eyes. I'm not an animal. What kind of person do you take me for? Dumpling dug through her things with a grin that said more than any words. Oh, what are you thinking? Did I say anything? Chris snorted. You mean you suspect I took advantage of that fox while she was out? Please. Dumpling crossed her arms and leaned toward him deliberately. I never doubted your charm, but I also never underestimated your lecherous mind. I refuse to believe you didn't do something to that beautiful woman. Wesley, still disoriented, stared at the two of them. He didn't understand their accusation, but one glance at the flamboyantly dressed Dumpling made him check himself again. Finding no injuries, he relaxed and picked clothes that fit. Chris, dressing in a custom-made suit, looked unbothered. My title as Chris the Succubus isn't for show. Just you watch. In less than 3 days, that little fox will be wrapped around my finger. Dumpling raised an eyebrow. I don't doubt your charm. I doubt your restraint. She fixed him with a look that could make someone confess to things they hadn't done. Chris shifted his gaze guiltily. He hadn't violated Fox while she was unconscious, but with a woman that beautiful lying there, he admitted to himself he hadn't been entirely saintly either. I was helping her bathe. She was filthy. Big deal, Chris protested. Really? Dumpling scooted closer, skeptical. She was about to be silenced the hard way when Wesley, finally dressed, interjected. Who are you people? And who is this fox? From the way they talked, Wesley pieced together a little. They weren't enemies, but they weren't allies with Fox either. That breathing room gave him courage. He pressed on. Who was chasing me? Why? What do you want? Chris and Dumpling exchanged an impatient look. I'm going to see if the little fox is awake. You can handle this one, Dumpling said, picking up the towel she'd dropped. Before Wesley could react, Dumpling's hand shot out. Too talkative, are we? A sharp blow landed on Wesley's cheekbone. Heat and pain seared through his face, and he fell back with a pained, ow. Dumpling jabbed his nose bridge and jeered, Get up and fight, coward. She followed with a violent knee to his stomach. Wesley doubled over, curling into himself. "Please, let me go," he wheezed. Dumpling kicked him in the groin and berated him. "Still can't read the situation? If you don't want to get beaten to death, then fight back, you coward." While Dumpling was educating Wesley, Chris had already reached the compartment door, but hesitated when he sensed movement beyond it. He muttered, "My charm's not working. Do I really have to be seen to charm someone?" Then, when Fox finished her setup, he kicked the door open. The thick wooden door slammed inward with a thunderous crash. Fox, who had been readying an ambush, froze for only a second before reacting. She grabbed a chair and swung it with all her strength. In that moment, she was in an overclocked state, every muscle firing at maximum, and the strike would have blown an ordinary man across the room. But the chair shattered on impact as if it had hit steel. Chris didn't even stagger. Fox didn't stop. She seized two chair legs mid-flight and lunged, thrusting them into Chris's chest. They had no effect. He caught her in a grip that anchored her in place. Realizing brute force wouldn't dislodge him and that she couldn't escape his hold, Fox changed tactics. Her voice softened. She folded into his arms as if embracing a lover. "I'm sorry. I thought you were the ones chasing me. I made a mistake." Chris leaned in and murmured, "It smells like a lie." Her ruse exposed, Fox thrashed again and raised a knee for a desperate strike. Even though Chris knew the blow wouldn't harm him, he intercepted it and, annoyed, tightened his hold. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered. With one hand, he took both of hers. With the other, he controlled her legs and pushed her down onto the bed. "If words won't convince you, then let me try other methods of persuasion." 115. Chris's friendship problem. The hotel room was quiet except for the thin curl of smoke drifting toward the ceiling. Fox lay on the king-size bed, the sheets draped over her smooth, naked body. She took a drag, exhaled slowly, and said in a husky voice, "Wow, you don't give up easily." Chris glanced over, confirmed it really was Fox, and let out a relieved laugh. "If you weren't so fragile, I'd have gone a lot further." She chuckled. "Maybe next time." When she finished the cigarette, Fox calmed down and, with polite firmness, declined Chris's implicit invitation. She couldn't handle his weight. Every time he exerted force during their rough play, it felt like a drilling machine pounding into her. If she hadn't felt the hard, heavy reality of his flesh herself, she might have sworn he was a Terminator from another time. "Oh, all right," she said. Chris rubbed the back of his head, trying to look embarrassed and helpless at once. Ever since killing Wendigo 5 times and absorbing all that orange life essence, Chris had been getting bigger. His weight had climbed past 300 kilograms, and his height had shot up to nearly 195 centimeters. If he didn't have increasing control over his own body, he'd likely be even bigger. That meant not every woman was suited to be with him anymore. He couldn't just pick someone up on a whim like before. Even something as small as his saliva was more than most people could tolerate. If Fox hadn't been a super assassin who understood unusual physical control techniques, she would have been seriously hurt during their antics. Whenever Fox moaned in response, Chris found himself envying Superman's energy field. If he had one of those, there would be no need to hold back. Fox started getting dressed while Chris lay on the bed, not moving. When she reached for the door, he spoke quickly. "Hey, just because things got more than friendly doesn't mean you can just leave." She folded her arms and leaned in the doorway, arching a brow. "What if I force my way out?" Fox had the training and instincts of a top assassin. She knew how to read people. She could tell the young man before her was dangerous, but he held no malice toward her and, if anything, seemed fond of her. So she decided to use that to her advantage and test him, to learn more without exposing herself. What she didn't expect was that Chris would be in tune with her in a way she couldn't detect. His ability to sense emotions had already picked up on the slightest shift in her thoughts. He smiled and let his voice stay calm. "I won't stop you from leaving. Just don't do anything you'll regret." Jiaozi was still in the middle of reshaping Wesley mentally. If Fox walked out and interrupted him, Chris could only promise she would still be alive. Beyond that, he couldn't guess how severely Jiaozi would punish her. He hoped Jiaozi would go easy, given what had happened between them. Fox, true to her name, sensed something was off. She wasn't in a hurry to leave anymore. Instead, she moved closer, stroked his head, and asked in a soft, perfumed whisper, "By the way, I don't even know your name. Isn't that a little unfair?" Chris stiffened, then wound an arm around her and asked with mock curiosity, "What mouthwash do you use? You don't have any bad breath at all." Fox rolled her eyes and gave him a sharp push. He wasn't joking. He really did notice. Chris himself had only stopped smelling after he transcended. In the first days after he transmigrated, he could smell the odd, decaying scent on his body, and it took a while to get rid of it. Even now, he sometimes caught the faint odor of old heather in his room. Seeing how serious he was, Fox sighed and explained, "It's a specific kind of body control. When I enter an overclocked state, my heart can beat over 300 times a minute. My circulation goes at a terrible speed, and that gives me my strength. Once I mastered that state, the breath problem disappeared." Chris's hand drifted down as he leaned closer. Under his enhanced vision, there was nothing untoward about her skin. No mites, no secretions. Proof the assassin network she came from had real skill. That kind of training could push ordinary people in the direction of a transcendent being, even if it only produced partial transcendent abilities. From what he'd learned through Cross and Wesley, those traits could be passed on. With artificial control, their organization might even manage to cultivate a true transcendent human. The obvious hitch, Chris thought, was how they'd keep such a being fed. Still, the problem of provision was not his to worry about. "Do you know how to train like that? Could you teach me?" His tone sounded tentative, but the pressure of his hand said he was serious. Fox yanked his hand away and scolded him, then narrowed her eyes. "I need to know who you are and what you want." Chris grinned and eased his hand back to rest on her hip. "I can trade. I'll give you information in return. Like a Sloan, that'll turn everything you believe on its head." Fox's pupils tightened. She had an uneasy hunch that what Chris was about to reveal would touch on the very creed she'd lived by for years. 116. The Mad Cross. While Chris was comforting Fox, Cross did not sit idle. A day and a night had passed since his son was taken. He had fought off several assassination attempts sent by Sloan and finally found a moment to recover. Back at his safe house, Cross rose from a bathtub of restorative fluid, shrugged on a coat, and walked to the window. He frowned at the house across the street and saw a lecherous man and woman making love. Cross recognized them instantly. The woman was his son's girlfriend. The man was his son's friend and colleague. In the past, to protect Wesley, Cross had never interfered in his life. Even when Wesley was cuckolded, humiliated, or bullied, Cross kept his existence secret. But now every excuse sounded hollow. His concessions and concealment had not given Wesley a stable life. They'd left him in chaos and pulled him toward a dangerous world Cross had hoped to spare him. If he could go back, he thought, he would have trained Wesley from childhood to be strong, not weak and exposed. Anger boiled up in him, amplified by the lewd noises next door. He grabbed the pistol from the table and, without aiming, fired toward the opposite house. A passing train masked the shots. When the noise died, two bodies lay in Wesley's shabby room, his girlfriend and his best friend. Wesley had long known about their affair, so if he saw it, he would only feel bitter and not believe Cross had done it. After dealing with the two pests, Cross slumped into a chair, hands covering his face. He still didn't know where his son had been taken or what Sloan planned. Waiting to die wasn't his style, and a blind rescue wasn't his method either. Sloan's aim was to kill him. As long as Cross lived, Wesley still had value. To buy his son time, Cross would have to put pressure on Sloan. After thorough preparations, he left the hideout to ask after old Brotherhood contacts. While Cross hunted the Brotherhood, Chris had already taken Wesley to Miami's busy city center. Chris looked at the bruised, swollen boy and produced a bottle of dragon blood potion, motioning for him to apply it. The dragon blood potion was, in plain terms, a high-energy synthetic drug designed to replenish depleted resources. Its healing effects depended on providing the body enough nutrients and energy to accelerate cellular repair. The body did the rest. After Wesley applied it and drank a little, the injuries suddenly didn't look as frightening and his pain eased, enough so he could walk. Jiaozi laughed excitedly. "Ho ho, kid, looks like we can give you extra training tonight." Wesley, relieved his body had recovered, suddenly felt despair at the thought. "Ha, my brother, don't tease him." Chris laughed, clapping Wesley on the shoulder, even as the boy winced. "Seems my brother's education worked," he said. "You look different, got a little of a fighter's edge now." After a day under Dumpling's instruction, Wesley's old inferiority and timidity had been replaced by courage and grit. His mood had been steadily improving. Left to develop like this, even without constant supervision, Wesley might become outstanding in normal society. After all, he carried Cross's bloodline and some of that talent. Wesley smiled sheepishly at Chris's praise but said nothing. He felt different not only mentally but physically. During the repairs by Dumpling, he had slipped into a strange, heightened state several times. His heartbeat pumped like an engine, his blood felt like a racing train. That shift brought a raw boost in strength and speed. He could even pick flies up with chopsticks, but it wasn't enough to resist Dumpling's bullying. He remembered being knocked down by the devil child even in that state, and felt a shiver as he watched the bracelet on Dumpling's wrist. He'd seen the child shake it and felt his will drain away. While Wesley replayed that memory, Chris led them into a shooting range. The staff politely cleared the other customers. Fox watched, puzzled. "What are we doing here? Teaching him to shoot? Why bother?" She already knew Sloane's reputation from Chris's telling, but it was only his side of the story. Though she liked Chris, she wanted hard evidence before she believed Sloane could be as monstrous as he claimed. The doubt had been planted, and Fox wasn't ready to return to Brotherhood headquarters until she'd investigated. So a detour to a shooting range confused her. Chris didn't need practice with weapons. She'd seen his sci-fi gear. Were they really training Wesley? Chris gave the simplest answer. Because it's fun. He picked up a pistol, took aim at the target, and emptied the magazine with effortless precision. Then he swapped in fresh rounds and handed the gun to Wesley with a grin. "Isn't it satisfying to train a good-for-nothing into a hero?" Fox laughed in exasperation. "You're crazy." Wesley nodded to himself, thinking, "I'm not a good-for-nothing." He knew he had changed. 117, the Brotherhood in a frenzy. A textile mill with an ancient history. Since the Brotherhood was founded 1,000 years ago by a handful of weavers who could glimpse fate, textiles and prophecy have always been intertwined. In peacetime, the Brotherhood earned money by weaving cloth. In crises, their cover as textile workers helped them move unseen. So even after Sloane seized power, he kept the mill as the Brotherhood's headquarters. Today, the headquarters was in chaos. Even the clerical workers running logistics couldn't find a moment's peace. All of it was because of one man, the super assassin called Cross. Sloane, the turn watched the turmoil in the facility with a gloomy face. This could not continue. "Have you confirmed anything about Fox yet?" he asked. He felt as if his plan had fallen apart before it began. He had risked everything, and now a competent general might be dead. His teeth ground together. The assistant replied quickly, "No, we can't confirm her death, but her chances of survival are slim. Her sports car was blown to pieces, and the target disappeared with it." Sloane closed his eyes. The photos of the explosion left little room for hope. Someone unfamiliar would have assumed they were shots from a war zone, but the presence of Wesley among the missing convinced him this wasn't Cross's work. His attitude toward Cross shifted instantly. "Notify the teams in the field to abort their missions. Call back every brother hunting Cross. We need to speak with him." The assistant hesitated. Sloane's order flew in the face of the loom's guidance, a dangerous thing to do. Sloane, however, was ready. He produced a stack of woven images and handed them over, speaking in a solemn tone. "This is a new revelation from the loom, unprecedented. I have a premonition that the calamity this new opponent may bring will equal all the sins we've slain over the last 1,000 years. Compared to that, whatever trouble Cross causes is minor. If the loom's vision is true, we have to use Cross's strength against this greater enemy." The assistant stared at the portrait woven into the fabric. How the loom could produce such an image seemed impossible. But as a senior brother, he had absolute faith in fate and in Sloane, who interpreted the loom's guidance. Without further protest, he took the images and left to find a way to contact Cross. Sloane pressed his hands to his temples. Cross's threat, the missing boy, the loom's warning, and Fox and Wesley's uncertain fates lay on his shoulders like an avalanche. He felt as if his head might split in two. Fortunately, he didn't have to solve everything at once. If he did, he might actually die. Meanwhile, the joys and sorrows of men don't line up. While Sloane was near panic, Chris was having a good time. A pretty woman teaching marksmanship over a streaming feed had boosted the Griffin brothers' shooting skills. Chris stood aside, swung his rifle, and watched the round arc perfectly into the bullseye. Jiaozi, Dumpling, refused to be outdone. She swung with all her force and felt a sharp, sickening twist in her arm. "Ah, fuck, bitch!" she howled, cursing Fox for not explaining the technique properly. It was clearly Jiaozi's own fault. She'd overestimated herself and tried a move she didn't understand. Chris watched her wail with detached amusement. Wesley pretended not to notice and kept practicing, though the small grin he couldn't hide betrayed how pleased he was. Fox stepped in to set Jiaozi's arm, paused, raised an eyebrow at Chris, and silently asked if she could fix the foul-mouthed kid. Chris shrugged, a look that said, "Do what you have to." Jiaozi let out a strangled "ah" and passed out from the pain. Spotting Chris's surprise, Fox explained, "The bone's back in. It's the fastest way. It hurts like hell." Chris understood. She'd used pain to snap Jiaozi out of her attitude and quiet her. He wasn't shocked by Fox's roughness. What surprised him was the sudden surge of feeling in Jiaozi. The violent reset had jolted her flattened emotions into life. The child's emotional numbness was instantly lifted. Chris, thinking like a tactician, considered storing the trick for future use. If Jiaozi ever fell into that hollow state again, this might be the quickest way to bring her back. He crouched stealthily and extended two thick fingers toward the prone girl. "Ah!" Jiaozi woke screaming. "What the hell are you doing?" Chris felt the swell of emotion in her and withdrew his hand expressionlessly, easing away from her line of sight. But his bulk didn't go unnoticed. Jiaozi glared at him and launched into a stream of abuse. "Are you crazy? Why did you pinch me? What, copying that idiot Pete and dodging a scolding? Is he brain dead? Are you? Fuck you." Fox couldn't help it. She burst out laughing. Then she forced herself to stop and said mildly, "Sorry, continue." That dry, perfunctory tone set Jiaozi off. She planted herself in front of Fox and bristled. "Continue? Continue doing what? Keep insulting Chris and making a clown out of him? Bitch!" As she stepped closer to retaliate, Jiaozi froze, taken aback by the view from this angle. "Wow, I've never seen this angle before. It's amazing." Those long, smooth legs, the curve of a figure that seemed to top any tower of legends, combined with Fox's serene, almost angelic face, left Jiaozi openly envious. "Chris, you really have luck with women," she said, half in admiration, half in resentment. To Fox, Jiaozi's love-struck expression was endearing, like a baby who's been woken up. She cocked her head and asked, almost puzzled, "What's up with this little one? She looks sleepy." 118. Sloane's plan. Chris ignored Fox's prying questions. He couldn't very well tell her that the little pervert was in heat and wanted to argue about the origin of life. Brushing her off, he led everyone back to the hotel and, as they walked, painted a grand future for Wesley. "You're a handsome fellow. You should value your gift," he said to Wesley. "Think of how many people live and die unnoticed, never leaving a mark. You're different. You're born for something great. My brother and I have already mapped it out for you. You only need to follow the plan." Jiaozi, Dumpling, sat comfortably on Chris's shoulder, surveying everything with the entitlement of a creature who'd been allowed that perch for far too long. He'd sulk if Chris moved him, so Chris kept him where he was and cradled Wesley in his other arm, half lecturing, half brainwashing the bewildered, provincial young man. "First, 3 days of marksmanship training," Chris continued. "Then we storm the Assassin Brotherhood headquarters. Use that elite dungeon as a warm-up. After we clear the Brotherhood, we'll look for the chance to open a global dungeon. We won't touch the two hardest ones. Iron Tower is already tied up, and Winter is Coming isn't something a small team should try. So we'll focus on the Orphans of the Fog City dungeon. It's risky, but it's doable. By then, you'll be part of the team at the table. We'll see what role the elders give you, and then plan the next move." Fox bristled. She was, after all, a member of the Assassin Brotherhood. How dare he call it a mob? "Do you really think so little of the Brotherhood?" she snapped. Even with you on your side, if my organization had to face this man and his father together, they would go and never come back." Chris, cool as ever, gently pushed the stunned Wesley aside and drew Fox in, smiling as he spoke to both of them. "I never meant to belittle your organization," he said. "Calling it a mob depends on what you compare it to. Do you know what I mean by the orphans of the Fog City dungeon?" Wesley and Fox exchanged looks. Even Jowsey cocked his head. Though he knew many things out of time, he didn't understand everything. Chris had no trouble with analogies. He liked comparing geopolitics to game dungeons. "No need to go into the others. We'll get France upset if we start ranking them. Here, let me be blunt. To clear the orphans of the Fog City dungeon, you have to effectively annihilate the Royal Navy, severely cripple the Royal Air Force, and leave an unmistakable mark on London itself. And you must do it without triggering punitive action from the other great powers. Only then is the quest complete. Does that make it clear?" Wesley's face went pale. The scale of the task was beyond comprehension. Fox's jaw dropped. She stared at Chris like he'd lost his mind. Jiaozi, on the other hand, brightened. This sounded like an entertaining game to try someday. Chris chuckled at Wesley's blank stare. "Don't freak out. You don't yet understand how vast your potential is." He leaned in. "You've already heard from Fox about who your father was. Once your talent awakens, you'll be even more dangerous than your father was. You'll see how fragile England is. With your abilities, and crucially, with my backing, you can pull off what I just described." Wesley still looked overwhelmed. Chris softened his tone. "I'm not asking you to do all that now. Like I said, first we work on marksmanship, then we use the Assassin Brotherhood for practice, then later we do the big things. Right now, focus on shooting straight. Everything else will follow." As Chris reassured a slowly returning Wesley, trouble was brewing elsewhere. At the Brotherhood's textile factory headquarters, Cross and Sloane faced one another in a room thick with tension. "You said this man killed Wesley," Cross said, keeping his voice low and level. "Show me the proof." Cross's pistol was steady in his hand. Sloane felt the barrel of it like ice against his skin, but he kept his face composed. He needed Cross's trust more than anything. Cross was the Brotherhood's former top assassin. Without his cooperation, Sloane's plan would not stand a chance. When several other Brotherhood members reached for their weapons, Sloane raised a hand and motioned them to lower them. "The letter I gave you is proof," Sloane said, forcing calm into his words. "Fate left its mark. This boy is the sinner we must eliminate." He spoke as if he truly believed it, letting the idea of a divine mandate settle in the air. Cross's answer was short and blunt. "I don't believe you. Give me my son, dead or alive, or this room dies with us." Cross's chest rose and fell with slow, controlled breath. Then, with a smooth motion, he unzipped his heavy coat to show what he meant. The inside of the garment was bristling with detonators and explosive charges. The sight of them made every breath in the room a little thinner. Sloane's heart leapt, but he steadied himself. "I don't know where Wesley is," he admitted. "I did send Fox to kidnap him, planning to use the boy to get to you, but the car was blown to pieces. Fox, your son, they vanished together. That's why I followed the loom of fate. I tracked you down and asked for help against the thing that struck us. This is the path fate laid out." To prove his point, Sloane produced the piece of paper printed by the loom, the words and images he had kept secret to protect his position. He'd hidden that information even from most of his own people. Showing it to Cross was calculated, a gamble. Cross took the paper. He knew Sloane's vanity and his hunger for power. Sloane's presentation could be an act, he reminded himself. Still, the image and the words on the sheet were enough to jolt him. He stared at them, then at Sloane, and the hardness in his face gave way to something like dread. Finally, Cross looked up and asked, flat and lethal, "So what do you intend to do?" 119. A world that's frightening, just by its name. Your progress is astonishing, kid. Chris couldn't help praising him as he watched the bullet carve a high-speed arc of air, curve around the stone pillar, and strike the target with pinpoint accuracy. Not bad. Your talent is even stronger than I expected. I thought it would take 3 days to get this kind of control, and you did it in less than 2. Wesley forced an awkward smile at the compliment. He hadn't even realized he had this much talent. If he hadn't been driven to the edge, Who would willingly endure such brutal training? Since waking up in that hotel, he hadn't rested for more than a moment over the last 2 days. Meals and sleep had been swapped for those little magical vials. He'd been surviving on potions that erased fatigue and hunger. It was that relentless regimen, together with the dragon blood potion that activated his latent talent, that let him accomplish in 2 days what normally took a month. Fox watched the perfect trajectory Wesley produced with a composed face, though she was impressed inside. After a pause, she said, "If he's ready, let him go do the mission now." "So soon? Doesn't he need to rest first?" Those words came from Chris, not from Wesley. Though Wesley had been remade over the past 2 days, shedding the cowardly boy he'd been, he was still intimidated by the 3 teachers who had forced that change. He wouldn't speak up unless absolutely necessary. So when Fox, the one he feared least, gave the order, he didn't dare object. Seeing Chris step in for him made tears spring to Wesley's eyes. He hadn't expected the Grandmaster to be so considerate. It felt almost overwhelming. That fragile hope evaporated quickly. However, when Chris continued, "Why don't you just give Wesley the address and let him handle it? There won't be any top experts inside, and Sloane's influence has weakened. He should be fine." Chris didn't care whether Wesley was exhausted. He and Fox had been enjoying themselves over the last 2 days, and Chris wanted Wesley to succeed for both their sakes. Fox, however, bristled. "No, I'm not tired," she said. She still wanted to prove whether Sloane was the selfish, hypocritical opportunist Chris made him out to be. Fox already suspected it, 90% certain, but without solid proof, she couldn't bring herself to believe that the man who had raised and trained her had betrayed the organization. Wesley felt his heart sink as the two of them exchanged looks. "Of course you're not tired. You've been eating and sleeping these past 2 days. But I am tired." The potions had kept his body going, but the mental exhaustion was stubborn. In 2 days, he'd learned more than an ordinary person could grasp in a lifetime. The accumulated strain was crushing. Jiaozi, Dumpling, noticed Wesley's inner turmoil and chuckled softly. "Ho ho, he's turning more and more into Pete's ferocious self." Chris glanced at Jiaozi but ignored the brat's impertinence. Still, seeing Wesley's weariness, he softened. "Ah Wei, I know you're exhausted, but think about it. Take down the Assassin Brotherhood, and you'll fulfill your father's last wish. You'll prove yourself." Hearing that tired, rehearsed speech, Wesley's eyes glazed over. He appeared to listen, but his mind had already drifted away. Chris waved a hand. "Fine. For the sake of our master-disciple relationship, I'll give you some help." He tapped his wristband, and a ripple of light appeared. From it, a rifle with an odd, almost sci-fi design materialized in his hands. "Look here. Don't say your master didn't look after you. This is the most powerful weapon I've got. You can borrow it for now." Wesley hefted the strange gun. It was heavy and hummed with latent power. He immediately felt it was no ordinary firearm. Fox, curious, moved closer. Chris grinned. "Do you two remember that explosion the other night?" "You mean?" Fox's pupils narrowed as she recalled that mysterious attack. She'd assumed Chris had used heavy rockets. But Chris's words suggested the destructive blast had actually come from this strange rifle. "That blast was from this gun?" Chris nodded. Wesley froze as he heard the name. Blast gun. A flood of fandom knowledge he'd picked up from online forums flashed into his head. Warhammer 40K, Bolters, Space Marines. He'd never been able to resist weird internet stuff. This was one of those crossovers his brain immediately jumped to. Seeing Chris's hulking frame and the array of other strange tech he'd shown, a ridiculous conclusion formed in a single thought. This guy is an Astartes who came from the warp. The next thought followed like a punch. It's over. This world is doomed. Before Jiaozi could take advantage of Wesley's stunned silence and tease him, Chris smacked the brat's shoulder. "You scoundrel! What nonsense are you thinking?" Wesley just stared, too shocked to be angry. Chris laughed and said, "The gun was actually made by my younger brother. Doesn't have anything to do with that messed up setting you're thinking of. If anything, only the name and the destructive power are similar." Fox eyed Jiaozi and Wesley in confusion, not understanding why Wesley had reacted so strongly to the gun's name. Jiaozi, displeased at being bothered, rolled his eyes and ignored her. With the misunderstanding cleared, Wesley cradled the blast gun, eager to get a feel for it. Do I have to go into the overclocked state? Isn't that a little extreme? Fox gave him a skeptical look. As a professional assassin whose life revolved around killing or preparing to kill, she rarely had time for the internet. Sci-fi weaponry wasn't in her usual education. The two worlds had never intersected for her. Chris, meanwhile, had an odd mental image of a famous two-dimensional assassin he knew of, then deliberately pushed it away. Whatever that memory drew in from other timelines and demon gods was trouble he didn't want. So he tamped it down and turned the conversation practical. If you don't want your apprentice's insides shaken into paste, he said dryly, tell him not to overclock. Fox's eyes narrowed. She resented the implication that she didn't know what she was doing. Wesley, however, was already testing the weapon. The moment he adjusted his state, he slid into the overclocked zone. The world slowed, his strength leapt past human limits, and everything became unnaturally sharp. He brought the blast gun to bear on a load-bearing stone pillar and pulled the trigger. The pillar detonated into fragments. The target behind it and the wall from which it hung disintegrated into smoke and rubble. The blast gun's destructive force reduced the immediate area to wasteland. The recoil, though, hit Wesley like a truck. Even in his enhanced state, he lacked the mass or grounding to fully absorb it. He was thrown backward. If his overclock hadn't pushed him beyond normal human limits, he'd have been a limp heap on the floor. As it was, he remained standing, cheeks flushed from the effort and adrenaline. How's that? Satisfied? Chris asked. Extremely, Wesley breathed, eyes glued to the wreckage. His excitement sent his pulse spiking, far beyond sane limits. Chris saw the danger and stepped forward, patting his shoulder to help channel the excess energy. Since we have this gun on our side, we won't need to intervene. Good chance to see what you can do. Wesley took it seriously. Leave it to me. With a weapon like this, I'd storm the Pentagon. Chris smiled and glanced at Fox, then signaled for her to hand over the Brotherhood's headquarters address. While Chris and his small team prepared to move on the textile factory, Sloan was already putting his plan into motion. He tucked the evidence that Wesley and Fox were still alive into a drawer and said without a flicker of emotion, I've located the boy. He's been staying at the Marriott these past few days. He practices at the shooting range next door during the day. Practicing shooting? Cross noticed the phrasing, but didn't linger on it. Fate had demanded this boy's death. Until that task was complete, Sloan was a useful tool. Sloan continued with the calm, measured tone of someone calculating variables. I'll send people to create an opening, an opportunity for you. Don't disappoint fate. Cross snorted, stood, and left the room. I only hope fate's forgiven you. If not, you're next. Sloane's face remained unreadable as Cross walked away. He waited a moment, then called. What's the situation now? There was a brief answer. Then, the boy and Fox have left the shooting range. Their target seems to be, The line went dead. Sloane's stomach tightened. He had a contingency, but losing an asset like Cross was regrettable. He dialed a different number, this one to the people waiting at the textile factory. Hello? Silence answered him. In the factory, the butcher, who'd been sharpening a blade, paused and then casually ended the call. Everyone present tensed and looked to him. The room's atmosphere thickened, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Cross, busy inspecting his sniper rifle, appeared unaffected as he adjusted his scope. The butcher slid his knife back into its sheath and approached Cross with an easy, forced smile. Cross, how about a little match? See if your knife skills rusted while you were away. Cross looked up, expression unreadable, and replied coolly, Fine, consider it a warm-up. The butcher relaxed a fraction and reached for his boning knife. Around them, others exhaled. Any hope of surviving a direct gunfight with Cross seemed slim, but if they could keep him from firing right away, they might live. Relief had barely set in when Cross moved. He didn't wait to be drawn in. He fired his sniper rifle, then drew a pistol from his waist and unloaded several shots. Each bullet arced with uncanny precision, bypassing cover and striking men who thought they were safely out of sight. Cross didn't waste time. After a handful of well-placed rounds, he dove away from his original position, adjusted his stance, and opened fire again. Where he had been standing was instantly riddled with bullets, a trap they hadn't seen coming. If he hadn't anticipated the ambush, he'd have been dead. When the smoke cleared, Only Cross and 3 others were still breathing in the room. The highest threats, the butcher among them, lay dead on the floor. Cross had taken them out before they had a chance to act.